All right. I hope you can hear me. This is the first time I'm presenting at a proper conference with people in front of me, although I cannot really see you, but it is what it is. So today we're going to talk about lateral movement on Windows environments. So I'll just start with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Riccardo. I work as a security consultant. I have some certification, but no one really cares about them. So the premise of the talk, I guess the best way to start is by defining what lateral movement is. And we can say that it is the act of reusing pre-obtained credentials in a form of username, password, ticket, token, or whatever to gain code execution on a remote host. Code execution means that in this context, we want to execute an implant. It can be COBOL Strike, can be whatever your fancy, really. And why we're talking about this? It's because it's really important. Like, we as red teamers, we almost every time need to use lateral movement on engagements. And even if you see, threat reports, threat actors, they also need to do that at some point, right? It is really unlikely that you can just fish a domain admin and, get on the workstation and, boom, engagement done. It doesn't really happen. So at some point, you will land on a system, and yeah, you will need to move on somewhere else to gain your objectives, really. But the main problem is that all the techniques that we've seen being used by other red teamers or by threat actors are, pretty well known, I guess. And EDRs and SOC are, getting quite used to it, and so things are not getting easier. Okay, so somehow we need to improve this. And how do we actually improve it? Well, I've proposed a simple framework that will help us deciding which technique is better in which context and stuff like that. Again, it's pretty simple. It's, we have 4 parameters. The first one, the file system artifacts, simply means, does it really need explanation? If a specific technique needs to write something on disk, it can be, DLL, it can be an executable or something, that's this parameter here. And second one, host artifact, it means simply if our technique needs to create or modify something on the host that doesn't necessarily falls into the file system artifact. It can be, creating or modify schedule tasks, services, stuff like that, right? Network artifact, again, pretty simple. Simply means that if you have to connect directly to a system to either trigger the code execution and to, gain command and control. The last one, I think it's the most interesting one. It's the prevalence / IOCs. It simply means that is this technique well known, and whether this, whatever you do during the technique has signatures that you can create detection on. To better explain this, this is the application of this framework to the default PSExec execution, right? So we see, a lot of people probably are familiar with PSExec. If you use PSExec to move laterally to another host, a lot of things are going to happen. And from a detection perspective, that's really simple to spot. So for file system artifacts, the PSExec will upload a binary on a remote host called PSExec svc.exe. It will create a new service, again, called PSExec svc. You will need to connect directly to the host. And in terms of IOCs, again, it's so simple and so abused that, if you really want to be stealthy doing a red team engagement or something, you really don't want to use that, right? So throughout the presentation, we're going to present other techniques, and we're going to apply the same framework to this one. And hopefully, at the end of the presentation, we will have a clear picture of what kind of things you can do, what kind of artifacts they leave on a remote host. So let's start with RPC-based execution methods. So it is a simply client-server communication mechanism. I don't want to go into the details of RPC because I don't really know them, right? But again, there's a pretty nice paper from SpectreOps that goes into the details on how you can reverse engineer and look for things in there. the thing that we only care about is that you can invoke methods on a remote server, right? And on Windows systems, it's used pretty much everywhere, really. We're going to use, as a primitive, a few interfaces. This task scheduler one, which you can use it to create, modify, delete, or execute a scheduled task on a remote host. Service control manager, same, but for services instead of tasks. And remote registry. Remote registry is pretty interesting, allows you to modify the registry on a remote host, and we're going to use it quite a lot. So task scheduler, again, this is the most basic example of what you can do with remote schedule task, right? But again, this is not something you want to do, because if you see at the command here, you're going to use the SCH task binary. You will create a task on a remote system that will point to a binary that you uploaded. Again, if you apply this to the framework that we just presented, you see that's not really ideal, right? So I guess we can do better, right? We have a few options here at the moment. And first is to replace the binary that a scheduled task is referring to. So, you have scheduled tasks, they, just point it to a binary. What if you swap the binary with your malicious one? It can be Cobalt Strike Beacon or whatever. Next time the task will get triggered, your malware will get executed instead. This, interestingly, was used during the Solar Gates attack. So it's pretty well documented. Second option that you have is to replace the action. So, every scheduled task has an action. Instead of replacing the binary, you can just modify the action that is stored within the scheduled task. So you will be able to execute your, executable or lolbean or whatever you think it's appropriate for that situation. Of course, there are some indicators for this. So when you're going to modify the action of a task, you will generate a few events on the event log. We're going to talk about them later and how they can kind of be avoided as well. But yeah, I've released a quick and small tool called Task Shell, and this is used to kind of automate what I just described. So you can just point it to a host and specify scheduled task and a binary that you want to execute instead of the actual scheduled task. So it would just do everything for you, right? You don't have to bother with it. And it will clean up as well after you execute your malicious command. So you can use this to, test your detections, validate whether they make sense or not. So there was a third option. So for those who are not familiar with DLL hijacking, so within Windows, if you can place DLL alongside executables that are vulnerable to DLL hijacking, it means that they're trying to load DLL, but it's not on the current folder, so they will use the Windows search order or something. And if you can place a DLL in a folder that has higher priority of the legitimate one, then you will be able to load your DLL. Now, you can do the same with scheduled task, right? If you target a binary that is referenced by a scheduled task, and you can technically use DLL hijacking to load your DLL into the legitimate process. But there are some problems with that approach, and I don't necessarily love it. The main reason being is that DLL hijacking is getting abused so much nowadays. Even by threat actors, they just use it all the time. So a lot of EDR products are getting pretty good at spotting abuse of DLL hijacks. So if we can kind of avoid it, I would probably stay away from it. But we're going to see another example of DLL hijacking when we're going to talk about DCOM-based execution mechanism. So you see, we just applied the same framework that I described to the techniques that we just talked about. So in your own time, you can just read the slides and pick the one that you're fancy. In terms of detection, so scheduled task has these event logs that can be populated whenever you create, modify, or run a scheduled task. Thing is, I've done a research, and it turns out that you don't really need to go through the task scheduler RPC interface to create scheduled tasks. So scheduled tasks are stored in the Windows registry. So my question was, well, can I just modify the registry so that I can create a scheduled task, but without necessarily, going through the classic interfaces? Well, it turns out you can actually, and this works really well for persistence as an example, right? So you land on a host, you want to create a malicious scheduled task or modify an existing one. You can just do some registry modification. It's not trivial to do it, and the reason is because the binary format where the tasks are stored, it's not that simple. They're not strings that you can just modify however you want, right? But the interesting thing is that if you go that way, you're not going to generate any of the events that we discussed above. So if you rely on detecting scheduled task abuse only with these events, then this technique can bypass most of it. There are some caveats, of course. Then you're going to generate other events, because then if you want to use this for lateral movement, you need to use remote registry, which again, it leaves other traces. But again, it's not that simple to detect remote scheduled task creation via remote registry only. Main problem is that the registry keys associated with scheduled tasks, they are protected. So it means that only the system user can modify them. So even, if, for example, from a remote host, you try to modify these keys and you authenticate as a user, that can be, even an administrator, you won't be able to do that like by default. It means that you need to use something like silver tickets, and then you need the NTLM hash of the computer account that you want to target to make sure that you're authenticating, but you also have the SID of the system user as well in your request. If you do that, again, I'm not going to read every part of the command, but basically you can forge a ticket for a remote host and impersonate the system as well, and that will allow you to modify the registry keys associated with the scheduled task. And that works pretty fine. It's not trivial. I'm probably not going to release tools that automate the whole thing, mostly because I cannot be bothered of writing, so many things. But anyways, that was it for scheduled tasks. So there is another pretty interesting Windows feature, which is the fax service. So fax service is installed on most Windows 10 workstation. Again, I don't know what it does, right? I don't care. But basically, what on the RPC specification of the fax protocol, you see that there is a specific function called register service provider. So again, the name says that, it's used for registering a service provider. And what a service provider is, it's just a DLL, right? So you can use this function to register a DLL that will act as a service provider. So can we use it somehow? It turns out we can actually use it somehow. So I did manage, after a fair amount of trial and error, to actually use that function, because the examples that are on the internet on how to use the fax service, boy, it's like documentation for 15 years ago. But I did manage to do that, and it turns out that the fax provider registration is mostly based on registry operations. So see here, there are some, this is from Procmon. You see some registry write operation where you target specific entries on the fax device provider, right? So what I was able to do, again, was to use the registry directly instead of going through the fax interface. And I was able to create and register a fax provider. So you can basically coerce the fax service to load arbitrary DLL that can be unsigned or whatever. So again, sorry for the huge code screen, but this is the implementation with using in-packet framework, right? So the first command here is just for checking the status of fax. Again, as I said, it's installed on most Windows 10 service workstation. Cannot be the case. It might be uninstalled or something, so it might be worth checking it before trying to exploit that. All the other ones are the commands that are used to create the registry keys needed for the provider loading. Again, this is all remote stuff, right? And last is actually starting the fax service. So when you're going to start the fax service, it will just load your DLL and get in code execution. So there was some research on the exploitation of fax because it was vulnerable to some DLL hijacks. Again, for the same reason that we've discussed before, I don't love DLL hijacks because they leave some traces that I really don't like. So if you can, coerce a program to load DLL using existing functionalities such as the service provider, then I guess it's a bit better. There's some caveats. So if you do it like that, you're going to get code execution, but just as network service. So not as system. However, though, if you see here on the actual, this is notepad.exe because that was spawned using the fax abuse. But if you see here, we have SC impersonate. It means that even if you're a network service, you can use all the potato exploit to elevate the system. There's another approach that we'll discuss it later. Another thing is that the fax SVC binary will just exit immediately after your DLL will get loaded. I don't know why, but it is what it is, right? So if you want to inject something like Cobalt Strike, then you need to load your DLL and perhaps inject it into an existing process or spawn a new one, whatever you want, really. So on the first note, the fact that it's getting executed as network service. I mean, we have remote credentials that we can use, as an administrator. So we can just change the service configuration and make it run as system, right? If we don't want to bother with, potato exploit or something. And then I just left some commands for reference on how to do it and the cleanup action. So that's simple to avoid. The second thing, again, it is kind of avoidable, because you can just inject your Cobalt Strike beacon in other processes. You don't necessarily need to live inside the fax service. However, it turns out that you can connect to fax using COM, okay? COM is just a nightmare. I'm not going to explain what it is just now because, we don't have time for that. But basically, if you connect to the fax interface via COM and use the connect method, then the fax server will stay up and running, so you can actually live inside the fax service. One caveat, though, is that you cannot connect directly to the COM interface of fax remotely, right? So you need to find something that would allow you to invoke, to create COM objects on remote host that cannot be really invoked remotely. And so Outlook, interestingly, when you install Outlook, it creates a COM server that exposes this create object method here. And basically, you can pass the name of an object, and it will create it for you on the remote host. Thing is, if you do it like this, you will bypass the remote activation restrictions, and so you would be able to connect fax using this weird Outlook thing. Is it feasible? Is it practical? I don't know. Can you do it? Yes. And this is a small demo. Let's see if video works. So see here, I've dropped beacon.dll on the C drive. Again, I've just moved it manually for the sake of the for this presentation. And then what I'm going to do is just checking the status of the fax service. It's stopped, but it's present. Checking the configuration, and yes, it is running as network service. In this case, we don't really care. And now we're just going to use the reg.py script from inpacket to configure all the keys needed for our provider to be loaded. And again, I've left them in the slides, and I will hopefully, I don't know what's happening there, but yeah, it seems that it worked, and the last thing that we have to do is eventually start the fax service. So it's not just going to start normally, but if you go in Process Hacker, you will see that it will go on start pending. But on the other side, we already obtained our Cobalt Strike beacon. Simple. Another interesting service on Windows is the NetTCP port sharing. Again, I have no clue what this service does, and I don't even care. What I care, though, is that the binary associated with this service is written in .NET. And so, for those who are not familiar, there is a specific attack called App Domain Manager Injection that targets every .NET binary, right? So you can place a configuration file next to every .NET binary, and that configuration file will specify, you know what, I need to load an additional .NET DLL in order to make this thing work, okay? And that additional DLL, you know, guess what, is something malicious that we created. So on Windows, this service, I think I haven't seen an instance where this service was not installed, so it's present everywhere pretty much. And you can just abuse App Domain Manager injection to gain code execution there. So what you need to do to exploit that is just drop your .NET base DLL in the Framework 64 folder v4 something, and then modify the configuration file that's already there. You don't even need to create that file, right? It's already there. You just need to modify the content of the file to specify that you need to load your DLL that you just dropped. And then you just enable and start the service. This one here is an example of the configuration file. The key line is this one here, the app domain manager type that specifies the name of the DLL that you want to load. Again, pretty simple, really, but it's interesting because I haven't seen this. I mean, the attack itself, the app domain manager injection, yes, it's pretty well known. The abuse against services that are already pre-installed on Windows, I haven't seen that before. One thing, another caveat in terms of privileges, if you gain code execution on this service, this method, you will obtain nothing, because this service is running as a virtual service account without any, fancy privileges. And, the first iteration of the technique, I was pretty excited. I just gave this to a colleague of mine, and he was doing this engagement. And so, yeah, he got code execution, bypassed the endpoint protection, whatever. And then we were just trying to inject into another process, and we're like, boom, access denied. And like, what's happening? Well, it turns out that, that service account doesn't really have too many privileges, but it is quite trivial to change that with change service config 2a. So you can change the configuration of a service and specify if you need additional privileges, okay? So in that case, we just added SC debug privilege to the service that it was required, and then when you start again the service, you will have that privilege as well, and so you can do whatever nasty thing you want to do on a Windows host. And again, that worked pretty fine, and we haven't seen that documented anywhere. Again, if we apply the same framework, these techniques are kind of noisy in terms of, artifact creation. Again, this framework is, of course, simplified a bit to what it should be, but for the sake of the presentation, we had to make it a bit simpler. But the really good stuff is that this is unknown stuff, really. So there are no, specific signature for this, and it's not trivial to detect them. Okay, let's go with DCOM. So some interesting stuff, hopefully. So DCOM is a technology that allows you the creation of COM objects on remote network endpoints. Again, I don't want to go into the details of DCOM, because someone probably will kill me if I say something wrong, but it has been abused so much for lateral movement in the past years. And the one that I've listed here are the most common type of COM objects that you can abuse. So, Internet Explorer, the MMC 2.0, the management console, stuff like that. Pretty well known. So my aim for this presentation was to bring, something new, hopefully. So the first one, control panel item. So the shell Windows object expose this control panel item method that allows you to load CPL file. And so for those who don't know, CPL file are just DLL, really, that export this CPL applet. And they've been abused a lot in red teamings, and so there are some public repos with some abuse. Not the specific technique, but the abuse of CPL. The interesting property is that if you double-click CPL file, will actually execute them as they were EXEs, so it's pretty simple and to use from a red team perspective. But again, we can use the method that we've discussed above to load CPL file. So how it works is, again, this is the PowerShell snippet. I'm using PowerShell just for this demo. Don't necessarily use them for real engagements, but again, you can use it in C#, you can use it from in-packet or whatever. So again, control panel item, you can just specify CPL file that you've dropped on disk on remote host. Again, dropping that on disk can be done by SMB or whatever, and you will just load the CPL file. So one problem though, if you try to do this on a recent Windows system, it's probably not going to work, because I don't know if it has been documented before, but the shell Windows COM object that was getting abused quite a lot to execute commands on remote host, there is something that just doesn't work anymore, right? You get an access denied. So again, we spoke about the Outlook object that kind of acts as a proxy. You can use that in this case here. So you will create an Outlook instance on remote host. You will use the create object method, and then after you obtain the actual object that you're interested in, you can invoke methods on it. Again, it was an interesting chain, but it does have a few problems from a detection perspective. So hopefully, with some of this stuff, you can detect the abuse of something similar. So of course, if you spawn Outlook with COM, the Outlook.exe process will be created with the embedding flag. And this is quite common with all the COM-based executions. So every process created by COM will be spawned with the embedding flag. And then Outlook will spawn control.exe, because control.exe is the actual binary used to run CPL file. Again, Outlook, Office process spawning something like control. Control is kind of considered one of the load beans. So, perhaps if there is a flaw in this technique is that this specific action is probably getting picked up by the pre-existing detections of Office binaries spawning load beans or something, right? And then control spawns run DLL, but that's standard. That's how it works. Again, this is taken from Sysmon. Again, you see here that control.exe. I mean, you probably don't even read them, but yeah, I assure you that control.exe is spawning is launched with CPL as an argument, and then here you will see that run.dll is actually executing the CPL file. Again, the relationship of Outlook spawning control.exe, it is pretty anomalous, and perhaps should flag about that. This one is interesting, controversial. So I had to redact this a few weeks before the presentation. So this was this is an EDR vendor, but they're known to be, you know how they are, right? They're not super friendly when you speak about vulnerabilities on EDR product. It's they don't like it. I don't know why. But this pretty famous EDR vendor, I hope I didn't leave some name of the EDR unredacted somewhere, because yeah, it can happen. That this specific EDR vendor registered a COM server that exposed a number of methods. One of them allowed you to load unsigned PowerShell script from disk. Now, the problem on abusing this technique for lateral movement was that it needed administrative access to the host. And by default, the permissions of the COM server did not allow this object to be created remotely. But again, we know how to avoid that, right? The second method is the one that we spoke about, so we can use something like Outlook. Again, I'm using Outlook in this case because it does expose that nice create object method. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one. Probably amongst all the COM objects, there are others that do something similar. Or we can programmatically modify the DCOM launch permission. Again, these are stored in the registry, right? So in the registry, you can there is this binary blob that says who can actually create COM objects and stuff like that. So if you know the structure of that binary blob, and this was already documented publicly, you can modify it, and hopefully you would be able to launch the COM object. I didn't want to bother with this one really, because it was I just had Outlook. It was so simple. How to do it? Again, simple stuff. First command, we create the Outlook object. We use the create object method. I have redacted this because it was so obvious who the vendor was. And then we can just use the invoke script on PowerShell script that has been dropped on disk. This was pretty dodgy. And again, I don't think the vendor itself considered this a vulnerability, but I don't care. Another thing that I've mentioned before that you can do with DCOM, right, is DLL hijack. So what this means is that with DCOM, you can spawn processes. So if there is a COM server that is associated with a binary, right, and that binary is vulnerable to DLL hijack, what if you can create that COM object remotely and you can place your malicious DLL on a specific location? Then, it would be pretty simple to just load your malicious DLL just with the COM triggering. Again, this was documented by ITsec in 2020. But I'm going to show you a simple process to find low-hanging fruits, because the blog post by ITsec, it was a bit generic, and it showed a few instances of binaries that are vulnerable, but I want to give you other ones as well, so that hopefully are not known, haven't been known until today. So the process to discover targets is pretty simple. If you're used to finding DLL hijacks on Windows, then it's not really surprising. We're going to use procmon and oliveview.net. And so we're going to find all the CLS ID by servers. Again, if you don't know COM internals, just forgive me. And we're just going to look for something that is a bit odd. And with odd, I mean, looking for binaries that, for example, are living outside System32, maybe in a subfolder. And the reason is simple, because most of the Windows DLL are in System32. So perhaps if you find something that is outside System32, you might be able, it is likely that that binary is missing at least a few DLL, and it's just going to try and load them from whatever location that binary is stored. And then with procmon, we can just filter for name not found. Again, this is standard procedure for finding DLL hijacks. And we can just create the object using oliveview.net. And if we obtain an entry with name not found within procmon, then that's a valid candidate. An example here, I mean, this not an example, but just showing what I've just described. Something that looks odd can be this print DRM engine that we're going to discuss in a bit. And so, you see this lives outside System32, just in a subfolder. We create instance, and then with procmon, we observe what's happening. So if you do that against that specific object, the co-BRM engine, I don't know what that is used for, but I know it's vulnerable to DLL hijack. You'll see that it will try to load this version.dll from a specific folder. Okay? So if you're an attacker and you can place a DLL in that specific location using, for example, SMB or something from a remote host, then you would be able to create remotely the COM object identified by this CLS ID. Windows will create the print BRM engine process for you. It will load version.dll, and hopefully you will get a shell. I don't want to discuss specifically how to craft payloads for DLL hijack, because that's a bit outside the scope of this presentation, but you can use tools like netclone to just target specific DLL that you created and just copy the export table with the one that you want to mimic, in this case version.dll, right? And it's just going to work. And that's the example where I create the COM object and I see all the name not found entries of the print BRM engine. Again, ooh, that was not expected. In terms of indicators, this, as we already discussed, this process, print VRM engine, will be spawned with the embedding flag because it is being created from COM. And so, again, you might be able to just check in your environment how often this print VRM engine process is getting spawned. And if it gets spawned a lot, is it still get created with the embedding flag? If not, if you see an instance of that, it might be because someone is trying to abuse that. Again, just applying the framework to the techniques that we've discussed. They're relatively unknown except for the CPL that has that weird Outlook and control.exe parent process relationship that, it is not ideal. But again, it might be weird enough that it's not being considered in your current detections. So, MMC. So the management console, the mmc.exe binary, that was another thing that was getting extremely abused because basically that COM object exposed a method to just invoke commands, right? So the abuse case in that specific scenario, you could drop a binary on a remote host and execute it via MMC, or drop something else and use a lolbean to execute it or something. There is another interesting feature, though, that has never been discussed, and it's the snap-in loading. So when in MMC you go on file, add, move, snap-in, and you just choose a snap-in that you want. Turns out that you can do it via COM, and by consequence, you can do it via DCOM as well. So from a remote host, you can create an MMC instance and a management console instance that's hidden from the user, and you can programmatically load snap-ins. Now you might think, what is the use of this? Load certificates? No, there is something more interesting we can do with that. Turns out that creating snap-ins, it's something that you can do. So, you can just create your own custom snap-in. And Microsoft is kind enough to provide us with all the templates that we need to do that. And snap-ins are just DLL again, right? It's not even fun anymore. In this case, specifically .NET-based DLL. And again, if you follow all the blog posts from Microsoft on how to do it, at some point it will tell you to use install.util against the new, your new snap-in DLL. But again, you want to install it from an attacker perspective. For the sake of this presentation, we want to install a snap-in remotely, right? Turns out that creation and registration of snap-in is just based on registry operation again. So we can create the appropriate registry entries on a remote host and use the method that I showed before to load the snap-in on the remote MMC instance. How to do it? I just left some code for you. So the first snippet here is the key modifications. So you see software Microsoft MMC snap-ins. They're stored here. And the subkeys are just GUID. So it is really simple to create. The values are pretty self-explanatory. You just need to put your directory of where the DLL is stored and the name of the DLL. If it's .NET, you specify the runtime and stuff like that. But other than that, it's pretty simple. The other thing that you need to do, of course, is use the MMC application. Again, this is a C# snippet. You can do it with whatever you want, really. And you just invoke the snapin.add method. And what's going to happen is that MMC will load your .NET assembly in memory. So that's pretty nice. And from a detection perspective, the main problem with the abuse of MMC with methods that were known before is that all the processes that you will spawn from an MMC that was created with the embedding flag, it was dodgy, right? Because you just never see that happening on a real environment in most cases, right? But this is a bit different because you're not creating new processes necessarily, right? You're just loading your .NET assembly memory on using the existing MMC instance. So that's pretty nice. There is one caveat, though, that I should mention, is that I know that some customers, some products as well, they don't necessarily care if MMC is spawning processes. The only thing that they care is whether there is an MMC instance that is being spawned with the embedding flag, meaning that is being created from comp. And again, if you use the technique as I've shown you here, you will create the same indicator and potentially it can be detected. There is one way to avoid that, and it is the use of MSC files. So MSC files, when you open the management console, you can, create your view, do your things, and then you can just save the view of the management console. And so you can save it, and it will get saved in an MSC file, okay? So if you craft an MSC file that will load your snap-in that was previously registered using all the registry stuff that we've discussed before, and you create a process, like you create mmc.exe, and as an argument, you put your MSC file, then the attack will work in the same way, but no mmc.exe instance will get spawned with the embedding flag. So it's just one less indicator. Again, from the people that I've discussed with, they say that creation of MSC file is not really common because there are just a few of them and they're all in specific directories protected by a trusted installer. So it's not something that happens all the time. But again, it's just another thing you can do to avoid this embedding indicator. So one additional thing on DCOM. And this is not necessarily related to code execution, right? But turns out that you can programmatically manipulate the Windows firewall from a remote host using DCOM. So if you think about it, how can you abuse it? Well, you're not going to get code execution with it, but you can effectively prevent EDR process from connecting outbound to their management console. And if you think that how many products rely on cloud telemetry for doing things, right? It's all of them, right? They still have some protections, so, on the endpoint, even if they don't have internet connectivity. But, there's not going to be an analyst that will receive the alerts because you can just block the specific binaries associated with an EDR product from the Windows firewall. You might think, this is a bit silly, Riccardo, this is never going to work. This has worked really well against all the major EDR vendors. So not ideal, right? From a security perspective. Think about you want to move laterally on a host, but you don't really know what's going to work, what's not going to work. So you don't want to take the risk of executing something that triggers an alert, and then the Security Operations Center will see what's going on and eradicate you from the network. So you can just modify the firewall, block outbound connections, still allow you to connect remotely, because if you just enable the firewall, just cut yourself off. It's not perfect. But then you have more freedom. You can just move to the host. If you generate, access log on events, stuff like that, it's not going to get forwarded to anything. So you're, a bit more freedom, actually. How this can be done, just a snippet in C#. Forgive me, because I've put some snippets with white background and now this dark background. It's just, I've done this stuff on a long span of time, so I just changed editors a lot of times. But it's really simple to use the firewall DCOM interface to just add new rules and block programs from connecting outbound. The only exception in terms of product that was not vulnerable to this specific implementation was Defender, surprisingly. So if you configure a new firewall rule that will block the MSMP whatever binary associated with Defender from communicating outbound, defender will get angry and it will delete that firewall rule and create an alert. Turns out it's really simple to bypass that as well. So I didn't explicitly publish the bypass for the defender detection, but you can just poke with the firewall configuration, and there's not too many options that you can use, right? You can block connection or allow only connections that have specific properties. In that case, specific properties is like, yes, allow connections only if they have IPsec. Who does have that for remote endpoints? And so you're not gonna, use a block rule. You're gonna use allow only if rule, but then the condition will never be met, and so effectively it is a block rule, and that will work as well. So that's an example with Splunk, with the detection lab configured with the Windows event forwarding. I'm just executing whoami. I'm looking in Splunk. If whoami was executed, it was indeed. And now we just, can move laterally to a system. We just, list C drive. The tool that we're going to use to configure the remote firewall is called Bronze Eyes, just blocking SVC hosts from communicating outbound. And so now we just execute another whoami. We verify whether our rule was actually configured on the remote host. We search again. Nothing. It's just the old one. Now, just to make sure, when I execute other commands like, classic net user enumeration, who uses that except for Conti? Yes, nothing. We can now disable the rule, search again, and then we'll see that the events has indeed arrived. And so, again, trivial technique, right? But it's pretty effective. And, from a red teaming perspective, sometimes we don't want to necessarily lower the security posture of our customers. So this might be a bit on the dodgy side, because we don't want to, if there's an actual attacker at the same time as us on the host, we want to give the security operations center chances to detect them at least. But again, it's not as noisy as disabling an EDR product entirely. That's too bad. I would never do that on an engagement. But blocking the firewall for just a few hours or minutes just to give me the chance of, getting on the host, dumping credentials, reusing them, and then you can just clean up the firewall rule and, all the events will get sent eventually. Usually, the events will reach the tenant at some point because they have some sort of queue mechanism, for just preventing data loss and stuff like that. So it's not too bad, but it will give you a huge span of time that you can use to, do your funky stuff. Over with DCOM, let's briefly talk about WMI. So event subscription, again, this was quite popular for persistence. And it was discussed in terms of lateral movement, again, in 2020 by MDSEC, but no POC was published on how to actually use WMI event subscription to execute code on remote host. So, event subscriptions are made by three components: an event filter, which is just a query that says, has a notepad.exe being spawned, an event consumer that, it is an action that we want to take after our condition specified in the event filter has been met, and the binder, which is just binding the filter with the consumer. Again, what can we do with that? A lot of nasty things, actually. So basically with event subscription, as I said, you can specify certain actions that you want to execute, and one of these actions is to execute VBS code. So VBS, being abused for, so much time. But interestingly, there is this open source project called Gadget2JScript. It's a new version of .NET 2JScript that allows you to, abuse a deserialization issue and load .NET assemblies from memory. And you can do it from VBS, VBA, JScript, or whatever, meaning that this is one of the fully fileless techniques. We don't need to drop anything on disk. We just create an event subscription with VBS code on it. The VBS is going to use gadget2j script to trigger this deserialization. Again, I know this is a bit convoluted, but I've made this tool to kind of automate all of that. And eventually, your .NET assembly will load some shellcode in memory, and again, Cobalt Strike or whatever. This is the flow of the whole attack. Oops. Basically, on the WMI query that we use to trigger the event, we just look for new authentication events. And so we just create the subscription, log in on the remote host again via another method, decom in this case, and then our .NET assembly will be loaded in memory. So the assembly that I've built in this project here, Liquid Snake, what it does, it just simply creates a name pipe server, waits for row byte to be sent on the name pipe, and treats everything as shellcode and just injects it in memory. So you can just execute this in the default configuration. You don't need to recompile, bother with gadget2j script, because it's not straightforward. But hopefully I've done most of the heavy lifting for you, and you can just use that to filelessly execute code on remote host. So no files written on disk or stuff like that. Again, there are many other techniques that are kind of defined as fileless, even PowerShell. If you, do a download execute cradle, is technically PowerShell. Is it stealthy though? Not really. So we don't want to, do those kind of things. This hopefully is a bit better from an operational security perspective. Again, on the repo that I've published, I've put a lot of the events, row events that you can use to create detections, and some Sigma rules that you can use to spot abuses of this generically. And so effectively what happens is that the process responsible for the event subscription will create name pipes, will load .NET assemblies. Again, I don't have enough data to tell you whether this is normal or not on an environment, but again, you might be in that position. So, you can do your research and see, does this happen normally in my environment on my customers? If not, you can create detections for that. Again, file system artifact is the important thing, none. And prevalence, again, at this point, since the first iteration of this technique was published in 2020, it is known, but again, it's not getting abused too much in the wild, so you might still be able to get away with that. Last technique for today is root providers. So providers within the WMI context are the source of information. You can create your own WMI provider. And initially, that was published by Cybereason a long time ago. Their suggested abuse was using PowerShell Cradle to execute commands. Again, it has been a few years, so now we need to improve because we cannot just use that and get away with PowerShell or something, right? So as I said, WMI providers are implemented as COM. We can create new providers and by registering COM objects on the remote host. Registration of COM objects happens via the registry. For those who have used COM in general, you can go in two ways. Local server 32, it means that your COM server would be an executable. In proc server 32 entries, it means that your COM server will be a DLL that will get loaded into another process. So we can go in two ways, and that is the C# code that you need to create the COM object using remote registry. Again, can do it with in-packet or whatever. And then C# code to actually create the new WMI provider and then load the WMI provider in memory. So effectively, you will load your DLL in a specific process memory and gain code execution. As I said, you can go in two ways mainly. So if you create a root provider using local server 32, so you point it to an executable, lol bin run DLL 32, whatever. It's not ideal. It is a nice alternative to classic WMI code execution that use Win32 process. The main reason is that process will get spawned as system, but as parent, they will have an SVC host process and not the WMI PRV-SC process that you will have normally, right? But again, we can do better, I think. So we can use the improc server 32. So just drop DLL on the remote host, configure the appropriate registry entries, and effectively have our DLL loaded by another WMI PRV-SC process that is running as system. So again, conceptually, it's pretty simple. There was some caveats. So the main issue really is that, if you're trying to load a provider, but the DLL that you're trying to load, it's not really a provider, WMI is going to complain a lot. And so it will effectively give you 60 seconds of timeout before your process gets killed if it's not really a WMI provider. Now, you might be asking, well, why don't you write a WMI provider? I don't know how to do it. Like, if you don't give me like a snippet, 10 codes of line, then it's just too much code. Turns out, though, that there is a simple way to avoid that, really. So if you ever created a DLL in C++ or anything, you know that when your DLL is attached, you have specific events, so DLL attach, DLL detach, or something. If you execute your injection code in the DLL detach, then WMI will not be able to kill the process, and so you will have a relatively stable code execution on remote host on a WMI PRV-SE process running as system. Again, they're noisy. They're really noisy, but they're not super known. And again, they're quite stable. So like, it is another thing that I haven't mentioned with the other ones. Of course, the techniques that we want to execute, they have to be stable somehow, because otherwise, what is the point? Almost done, guys. So the last thing that I haven't touched before is, yes, you can execute code on a remote host, but if you want command and control, what can you do? What can you do really? Because if an attacker compromised a workstation, that can egress to the internet most of the times. If you compromise a server, that might not be able to talk to the internet, so you cannot really deploy outbound HTTP command and control there, because that's probably not going to work. Even if the host can go to the internet, most of the time they have to go through a proxy that only allows Kerberos or NTLM authentication. So if you get code execution as system, then you will authenticate with a proxy as the computer account, which I hope that it is blocked in most environments. So you have other options. So by default, Cobalt Strike. I mean, I'm talking about Cobalt Strike because that's what I use for work. But it does offer you some options. The first one is SMB. So you just open an SMB pipe, you connect to it, and you establish command and control. But that is kind of the pattern that you need to connect directly to the host to establish command and control. So there is a project that we've published a few years ago, actually, called C3, so Custom Command and Control, which allows you to use everything as command and control. You can use LDAP. So if you have code execution on a host, code execution on another host, they can use LDAP and write their needed information on the attribute of a user account that you control to exchange information. So the actual connection doesn't never happen between the two hosts directly, but it goes through the domain controllers. Another interesting one that we've used a lot is file share. So if you have a file share where you can write on an internal environment, you can use that as pivot. And so both parties of the communication will just write, read, and modify files within that file share, and they will use that to communicate without direct connection. There's a nice presentation that was done last year's Black Hat on all these various command and control channels, and I highly recommend checking that as well. To conclude, we examined a few techniques. They're not necessarily the best. Again, I had to be generic enough, but depending on your situation, you might need other things. I guess the key point is you can readapt most of the persistence techniques on Windows to work even as lateral movement, right? And just try to find all the techniques that require, the least amount of primitives needed to gain code execution. And that was it.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one question. Does somebody have a question?
No questions.
Always maybe I ask one. Apart from monitoring and detection of the artifacts, what would you say is like the best hardening steps in these?
It is tricky. It is quite tricky. I guess that some of the best customers that we have, they started creating some sort of models of behaviors for users. So, for example, if you connect to a system and that user has never been connected to that system before, then it will generate anomalies and that will trigger investigation, regardless of what technique you use. So there are some customers that have really high security posture, but I guess in terms of hardening, trying to reduce as much as possible the privileges of user accounts, of service accounts that are used to manage other systems is key.
Okay.
Cool.
Then we thank the speaker again, and now I guess we have lunch.